we go. Okay, we're recording.
Right. I think we can start now. So, right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to the 8th Sociological Conference, Sociology in Time of the Pandemic. I'm Anna Fikry, sociologist from Ilia State University, and I'm really honored to chair this opening expert panel and to welcome our distinguished guest professors here. Before I pass on to speaker, I just couple of things to say about this conference. As many of you may know, I know that there are sociologists here who have been attending conference for a long time. The annual sociological conference was established in 2012 at Ilia State University. It takes place every other year and invites sociologists to reflect and discuss current challenges in society we are facing locally and globally. As you know, the annual sociological conference always takes place usually at Ilia State University in person, but this year this is held online. I think this year is special. I'm sure this year this conference is special, and I would say it's historic. And now let me turn to our guests for today. I would like to welcome Professor Michael Ryan as a first keynote speaker to our conference. Professor Ryan will speak about social consequences of the pandemic and post-pandemic possibilities. Mike Ryan is a professor of sociology at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. He has previously held academic positions in Portugal, Egypt, Ecuador, and the United States of America. Before returning to academia, Dr. Ryan worked as a research methodologist at the National Center of Health Statistics in Washington, D.C. He's the editor of multiple volumes, including COVID-19, global pandemic, societal responses, ideological solutions, COVID-19, social consequences, and cultural adaptations, gender in the Middle East and North Africa, contemporary issues and challenges. The core concepts in sociology, which is published in 2019. Dr. Ryan is also the series editor of the COVID-19 pandemic series for Routledge Publishers. So we have the pleasure for the next 50 minutes or 20 minutes, I think, to listen to Professor Ryan. I do not want to use your time. After that, we're going to have some time for Q&A. Please put your questions into the chat and I will pass it on to professors. So with no further ado, Professor Michael Ryan, on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that very warm introduction. Thanks to the state for putting this together. Oops, getting a bit of feedback there, sorry. And the other panelists for joining in today. I know it's different times in different parts of the world. I think I'm getting a bit of feedback. Anna, maybe if you mute. Here, actually, I think I can do it. There we go. Let's try again. Okay, sorry. So anyway, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the audience for joining us. I know that it's July and we'd rather be on a beach somewhere. At least I would rather be on a beach somewhere. And I know that we're kind of probably getting worn out with thinking about COVID-19 and talking about COVID-19 and living with COVID-19. But it's the reality we're in. I think it's important that we continue engaging in this so that we can stop having to think about it and live with it. I very much look forward to the day when these kinds of conferences are not about something that's ongoing, something that's getting worse, but about something that happened in the past. And whether we get there or not is one of the things that I think will come out of my talk today. So since I'm kicking it off here, I just want to start with some general basic comments just to get our minds warmed up a little bit, as if any of us really needed to get our minds warmed up to think about the topic, I realize, but just to get our mental juices flowing. So in March 2020, the world changed. The world is always changing, sometimes in quite dramatic ways, but this change was different. This time, it wasn't just politics or politicians, the economy, or some new technology instituting a change. Neither was it a war projecting a visible enemy, something that we can see. And this time, the change wasn't just in one country or one region or for one group of people. This time, the change was for nearly every aspect of life and for nearly every person on the planet. This time, the change was to the everyday existence of humanity and for all humans. And while what these changes have been and what they have meant has varied along many of the same predictable social fractions that we find with other social disruptions, the rich have generally done better, the racially privileged have generally done better, the wealthy neo-colonialist countries have generally done better. The fact that so many things changed and for so many people has indeed made the COVID-19 pandemic something unprecedented in living human history. During my talk today, I'm going to interweave reflections on my own experiences during the pandemic with links to broader social issues, using what C. Wright Mills calls the sociological imagination. I think this approach is important because it helps to highlight this link between the individual, in this case myself, and the collective, in this case a global society. And highlighting that link between single individuals and between a 7 billion plus humanity is one of the many things I think this virus has done. It's shown the ways that factory workers in India and politicians in Ireland and middle-class folks in Georgia are all linked. And this is also one of the many purposes of sociology, to show these links. So my own experience with the pandemic has followed the lines of many others, at least those of us lucky enough to have some elements of privilege in our demographics and to carry passports from vaccine hoarding countries, a topic I'll come back to. On March 11th, 2020, when the World Health Organization first declared the SARS-CoV-2 virus to be a global pandemic, I was living and teaching in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was one of the first countries in the world to go into full lockdown, and my university, Nazarbayev University, was one of the first to fully move to online classes. Initially, I was, to put it mildly, skeptical. I was, and it's embarrassing to admit now, one of those who thought this was nothing more than a little flu and another drama scripted by the powers that be to distract attention from the increasing injustices and the near unbelievable inequalities in the world, the kinds of things we're all familiar with as sociologists. My first thought was that this was something akin to the killer bee pandemics that I remember from my childhood growing up in the United States. During the 1980s in the US, there were near annual panics that all of civilization was set to be wiped out by these killer African bees. African bees, by the way, that were in fact a variety of European bees and supposed to be heading up from South America. Even as a young kid, I came to realize that public panics often have political motivations. I also remember the great bird flu scare in the early 2000s, another global threat that never quite reached the shores of the US or really many nations, but that made billions for pharmaceutical companies. I distinctly remember during that time being a graduate student at the University of Maryland and the university spending $92 million on a bird flu preparedness plan, all during a time when professors were being furloughed, tuitions were rising, and graduate students were already losing our already meager stipends. I've also always been sensitive to these kinds of issues of resource allocation and the dare and scare mentalities that tend to direct monies to visible threats, even if they're not necessarily the most egregious ones. So when talk of this new monster virus started to sweep the planet, I have to confess, a bit skeptical. Now, more than a year later, I can also confess that I was wrong, very wrong, at least about many things. And I'm going to come back to what some of those things that I was right about were. As lockdowns began and confirmed numbers kept rising, I quickly came to realize that this time it was different. This time there really was a wolf in the pasture. I also came to realize that this wolf was something that was going to have far-ranging, long-lasting social implications. And in an effort to make my own small contribution to combating the pandemic, I pulled together 2 edited volumes drawing on a wide range of social scientists. Many of them are here with us today, I'm happy to say, on the panel, and from nearly a dozen countries across 5 continents. I've also just recently finished another book on COVID-19, looking specifically at social inequalities and also at human possibilities. But I don't want to talk today about the findings from those books or really about any of my other research on the pandemic. What I would like to do today instead are add some reflections on the possibilities, and that's the key word, possibilities, of a potential post-pandemic world. So I want to consider questions like, will we ever go back to the way things were? Should we, even if we could? And what opportunities are now available to build or to rebuild a better world? There are lots of answers and endless debates to those questions, but the answer I like best lies in one of my favorite quotes by speculative fiction writer William Gibson. And he says, quote, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed," end quote. This quote, I think, neatly sums up most human societies and painfully accurately describes global human relations. The quote implies that the common luxuries of tomorrow already exist for the elite of today. Things like digital access, communication technologies, and to the point of the talk, COVID-19 vaccines are already available to the global elite and are likely, at least I hope, to become common luxuries available to everyone in the future. We can also see just how accurate this quote is to describe the situation of pandemic recovery, where we can even begin to think about using that word recovery. In some countries like the US, life has more or less returned to normal for many. I think it's very important to note that that return to quote unquote normal has resulted in a dramatic upsurge of confirmed cases of the virus almost exclusively among the unvaccinated. While in other countries like India, Thailand, Malaysia, the pandemic is reaching new devastating levels. And in other countries like Georgia, it's on a worrying rise. Georgia, as I'm sure you know, is well into a second wave. So I've already confessed that I was initially quite wrong about many things. Most clearly, I was wrong about the impact of the virus and what it would have on the world. In other ways, however, my initial concerns have unfortunately panned out. My initial concerns, for example, that the pandemic would be used to distract attention from other social issues really wasn't far off the mark. So while global poverty has increased for the first time in more than a decade, we're simultaneously witnessing the fastest the fastest accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few men. And it is important to note that they are men in recorded human history. An additional 150 million people are expected to be pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic. That's additional people. All while Elon Musk has increased his wealth by nearly $150 billion just since the pandemic began. Everyday economies are struggling, but certain individual economies are soaring. My concerns about the pandemic being turned political have also held weight. Whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, or former President Trump in the US, politicians the world over have taken advantage of the pandemic for their own political gain. Laws have been passed under the table, political bases have been rallied against enemies, both real but mostly fictitious, and pressing social issues have been swept under the rug. The emerging use of vaccines as a tool of foreign policy has also become increasingly apparent. Virtually no aspect of the pandemic has not been made political, even though the virus itself doesn't have a political affiliation. In the end, the pandemic has done much to highlight global inequalities. It's made it increasingly clear, as if it were not enough so already, that we must do more to understand the inextricable link between medicine and society, between the biological and the social, between the individual and the collective. It has laid bare a number of social inequalities related to education, religion, politics, economies, race, gender, sexuality, you name it. And perhaps more importantly than just highlighting global inequalities, the pandemic has done much to exacerbate those inequalities. Throughout all of this, and with no doubt a bit of bias here, it's become clear that social scientists have a role to play in the world today, and a bigger one than we've thus far been given credit for. It's essential that medical doctors understand infectious agents like the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's also essential that social scientists help understand why some things and some people become, quote, essential during times of crisis. The task of medical doctors is to keep us alive and healthy. The task of social scientists is to understand why some of us are left to die and without access to healthcare. Those are, of course, gross oversimplifications, but I think they do start to broadly paint the picture of the value of social science and the need for social scientists to take our place alongside medical professionals, especially during times of global medical crises. So to circle back to some of the questions I posed at the beginning of the talk, it's unlikely, at least for the foreseeable future, that we will ever live in a truly post-COVID-19 world. The virus is not so likely to end as it is to become endemic. In other words, all signs, at least for the moment, point less towards adapting to a world free from the virus and more toward adapting to a world where the virus becomes a part of our everyday lives. And I'm happy to expand on that point during question and answer if anyone would like me to. Where the world goes now, both in terms of response to the virus and the associated pandemic, I think is still really anybody's guess. Ramifications of existing inequalities and discrimination are being increasingly brought to attention, as well as exacerbated by the ongoing situation. That said, the alarm of such ramifications has also started to sound increasingly louder. Will enough people hear it? Will they hear it in time? Will the virus or the pandemic be what brings us as a humanity together, or what tears us further apart? Predictions are difficult to make with any amount of certainty, but potential hopes, I think, can be fostered. And it's now up to us as a global collective to decide whether we want to recognize what those hopes might be. So as hesitant as I am to confess any sense of optimism, I am a trained sociologist, after all. Those of you who are sociologists, you know we tend to be a depressing lot. I do think there are indeed some telling signs that all might not yet be lost. There does seem to be some increasing awareness of global interconnectedness, no doubt boosted by the pre-existing movements related to other humanity-facing issues such as global climate change and nuclear war. Examples of this include things like Noreen Mahmoudi's Outbreak of Generosity campaign, which is aiming to mobilize youth to help vulnerable communities across Europe. Swedish environmental activist Greta Thunberg, who donated more than $100,000 of her Gulbenkian Prize for Humanity award monies to fight environmental destruction and protect indigenous populations living in the Brazilian Amazon against COVID-19. And if nothing else, an increased attention to the goings-on in the other parts of the world that are not our own. I think this panel is a good example of that. So the pandemic has indeed done much to highlight our global interconnectedness. When the Serum Institute of India, which is the world's largest producer of vaccines, experiences a fire, worker shortages, or some kind of political pressures, that impacts everyone. It impacts cocoa farmers in Bolivia, artists in Berlin, and students in Tbilisi. When global lockdowns occur, hotels in Vancouver and Beijing and Batumi all feel the effects. And when economic recoveries happen in China, Germany, and the United States, societal and individual economies around the world are all impacted. We're all connected. And the only way to truly control the pandemic then is to ensure the recovery of societies and economies of all peoples. To circle back to my own story, eventually, now thanks to privilege that I have that's not shared by enough, I've been able to get vaccinated, which is quickly emerging as a new marker of global inequality and political debate, when it should not be, that is costing far too many lives, and doing so as a consequence of human failings rather than biological science. And now that I'm among the fortunate who's able to shift my attention from just getting through the day, which I think is what many of us have been doing over the last year and a half, and what most people are still doing as they await their vaccine or they're in countries where this is an increasing worry, I now have the luxury to move beyond that to some degree, to begin to think about the future. Many questions remain, but one certainty is that the ability to even reflect on these questions represents a real privilege during a time when the pandemic is still raging and so many millions or billions are still just trying to make it through to tomorrow. We're a long way from having sufficient vaccines to inoculate every person on the planet. We're an even longer way from getting those vaccines into everybody's arms. The impacts of the pandemic, including lost years of education, mounting debts, and untold psychological traumas, are going to take even longer to remedy. While figuring out how to control the virus was a necessary triage priority, the real battle is only just beginning as we figure out how to rebuild our societies, and to do so in hopefully a more just, equitable, and sustainable way. So as vaccine rollouts continue around the world, we now stand at an important crossroads. Do we, as we have done, continue to worry only about the global jet set elite, to prioritize stock markets over food banks, and to value passports over a shared humanity? Or do we return to our now seemingly long lost commitments that we all seem to express in the beginning, that we're all in this together, and to recognize ourselves as fellow members of the same species and one of many species sharing the same planet, to value essential workers the same as we do hedge fund managers, and to unite together to defeat a common biological foe? Medical doctors and scientists have done an unprecedented job at helping us to prevent the continued spread of the virus. And it's now up to us as fellow human beings to truly cure the world. So ending on that note of cautious optimism, I want to thank you for attention. I will look forward to your questions, and I will turn it back over to Anna and to our next panelists. Thank you.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful presentation, very interesting presentation. Once again, first of all, I would like also to ask to the audience to put your questions into the chat, and I will try to pass it on to the presenters. And once again, I would like to welcome to our honored speakers and guests from different universities. We have here Sharyn Graham Davies, from Monash University, Australia. Also Susanna Trnka from University of Auckland, New Zealand. Naha from University of Toronto, Canada, and Professor Sari Hanafi, President of International Sociological Association. We are really honored to have you here, and we are very much looking forward to our speakers and to our interesting debates after these presentations. So our second speaker, as you know, is the Professor Sharyn Graham Davies from Monash University, Australia. She will speak about the care and responsibility under lockdown. So a couple of words about the presenters I would like to say here. Professor Sharyn is a director of the Hiv Indonesia Engagement Center and associate professor in the School of Languages, Literatures, Cultures and Linguistics at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. She received her PhD from University of Western Australia, Anthropology and Asian Studies. And prior to her appointment at Monash was at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. Sharyn has held visiting fellowship at Cambridge, Yale, Sydney, Peking and Ilia universities, and has been awarded Fulbright, Leverhulme and Marsden funding. Sharyn's research focuses primarily on gender, sexuality, policing, social media, and moral surveillance. Professor Sharyn, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Anna, so much. And thank you, Michael. It's lovely to meet you. We've been emailing a lot over the last while, and congratulations again on the book series. I mean, the timeliness, of getting all of that out was fantastic. So congratulations, and we're hoping to see you in the Southern Hemisphere at some point. We've got lots of amazing things in Melbourne to show you. And to that end, we're actually hosting the Asian Studies, Australian Asian Studies Conference here in July next year. And we think of Asia in the most expansive way. So if anybody can actually travel, then it'd be great to see you here. And we're also doing it virtually. So we'd love to see some representation from that side of the world. I've got a slideshow that I'm going to share, and in there I've got a slight apology because I've been writing my talk that I was originally going to do, but I work primarily in Indonesia, and it just was kind of incumbent on me, I guess, to kind of talk a little bit about that, given the urgency of what's happening there. So I'll just share my screen here. Okay, so what I was going to talk about was the work that Susanna and I and others, including Nick Long, who's at LSE, have been doing now for 18 months. And some of us have continued to meet every Monday night on Zoom, and we're up to, I can't remember, something like 72 meetings or something for this group, which is called the Care and Responsibility Under Lockdown Group. And the majority of researchers are from New Zealand, but as I said, Nick in the UK, and now I'm in Melbourne. So I was going to talk about that and give you an idea of the kinds of things we've been doing in there. There's a whole lot of work we've done. We've published on things such as bubbles as a containment strategy, and we're just trying to get the Australian media now to uptake this, because Sydney is in its 5th or 6th or 7th week of a lockdown, and it is going to extend until September most likely. And so our research on how to construct bubbles and give them space where you can provide care to others but also keep the community safe will be really useful, we think, for the Australian government as it goes forward. With this lockdown, I'm in Melbourne. We've been in lockdown now for 2 weeks. We're down to just a handful of cases, but I can just see on Twitter that there's mass protests across Melbourne and across Sydney, and these are going to be super spreader events. So just as we're hoping to be at the end of our lockdown here, we've got protesters out without masks, and it's not looking great news here. Our Carol research also looked at risk and responsibility, and Susanna was lead author on an article for that, which was published in the Royal Society in New Zealand. We've looked at community nursing, at community policing, and also at funerals. And so you can have a look, just Carol Collective at WordPress. One of our team members, Archer, has put a website together with all of our bios, all of our work, and things like that. So do have a look at that. But what I'm going to talk in my 15 minutes or so about today is Indonesia. And this is my primary research place. I've been working and researching Indonesia since 1994 when I first went as an undergrad. And so it's my primary focus. And the news we're getting out, which is not much covered in Western media or media outside Indonesia, is not giving it enough attention. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. And we can see this headline that was posted yesterday. Indonesia is now the new epicenter of the COVID pandemic as the Delta variant surges and vaccination rates lag. So it was Brazil and other India, but now Indonesia is having this surge. And part of that reason is because vaccines, 6% of the population have been vaccinated, and there's 260 million people in Indonesia. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. The work I'll talk about today I've been doing with Najma. Indonesian, lots of Indonesians only have one name, so her name is Najma, and she is my recently graduated PhD student, and we've been working on this for a few months now, and we've co-authored a few publications, mostly kind of in the blog space, so we can quickly get things out into the media. And we normally present together, but I changed topics this morning, so I'll run solo with this, and she's also traveling because Eid celebrations have just finished. So what Najma and I have been looking specifically at COVID-19 and stigma. So in Indonesia and probably elsewhere, there's a lot of stigma associated with having COVID. And just last week, my friend's father died. Beyond doubt, it was COVID, but it's reported to everybody as tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is the kind of disease, you can die from tuberculosis and there's not a stigma associated with that. And so people often pass away from complications of HIV and other diseases and illnesses, and people just say it's tuberculosis. That's the go-to thing. So people don't want to say that they have COVID. They don't want to acknowledge that someone in their house has COVID because they'll be shunned from their village, from their community. And so nobody admits to having COVID, nobody gets a test for having COVID. And so of course, people think it's not such a problem. So we've been looking at that. We've also been looking at accessing HIV care. So Najma did her PhD on pregnant women accessing HIV care, and particularly prevention of mother-to-child transmission services. And so she has a real interest in looking at how access to HIV care has been impacted by COVID-19. And there's no good story coming out of that. And again, just in the last few days, one of her participants, who she's known now for 4 years of her research, was a mother with 6 children and had been managing successfully her HIV and the HIV of her children. But with COVID, the mother was worried about going to hospital and the clinics to access her antiretroviral medication. And when she did go and get checked, it's complicated to disclose that you have HIV because you won't be provided with access. People will say, you've got HIV, we're not dealing with that now, go away. We're just dealing on COVID. And so she passed away because she couldn't get access to her HIV medication. So I've been writing a bit about that. And we've also been writing about unreliable cases, case and testing numbers. I've got a slide on that in a moment. But what I want to talk about today is vaccine hesitancy, because we saw just on this slide that part of the reason for the surge is that people aren't getting vaccinated. So officially, Indonesia, what have we got? So in July, it's looking at 35,000 new cases a day and just over 1,000 deaths. But these numbers are meaningless, and they're meaningless because people can't get tested. It's up to $60 to get tested, and that's just beyond the reach of almost everybody to go and pay $60 to get a test. And even if you could afford that, it's difficult to access the testing site. So in Sydney, people are sitting in their cars for 3 hours to get a test. And in Indonesia, it's even more difficult. People don't have the time, to sit and wait for that test. And moreover, you don't sit in a nice, comfortable car. You have to do it in person without that kind of protection. And so there's a very real fear that if you go to get tested and you don't have COVID, when you leave the testing site, you will have COVID. So most people aren't getting tested. So whatever the government is reporting is a pale number compared to the real case of number. And as I mentioned before, people are passing away and are buried straight away. There's a lot of people don't have birth certificates, and so you can't get a death certificate if you don't have a birth certificate. And even if they do, there's just no processes for that formal death to be reported. People are just buried. There's no COVID test when people die. It's reported as whatever the family says. So the evidence that is there suggests much higher rates of COVID. And so in Jakarta, 1 in 2 people have the antibodies. So almost half of Jakarta residents have antibodies against COVID-19, indicating greater spread than reported. And an article that just came out a few weeks ago, sometime in July, is saying that we will probably see 400,000 new COVID cases in Indonesia each day. And so this won't be reported because there's just no ability to test people. But this is what the likely number is. So a big problem is vaccine hesitancy. So in December 2020, a survey was done and it suggested 37% of people were hesitant to receive the vaccine. Anecdotal evidence suggests that that figure is much higher. So as of today, 6% of the population are fully vaccinated, and they're vaccinated with Sinovac, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So the efficacy of that is dubious. So Najma and I wanted to look at why are people so hesitant in Indonesia to get the vaccine, and we applied for funding from DFAT, which is the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and so they've given funding to support this. And what Najma has done in the last little while is interview 50 women in Sumatra. So she looked particularly for women who had these vulnerabilities around HIV. So 20 women living with HIV, 20 women who had been pregnant in the last 12 months, and 10 frontline health workers. And what we've found through all of the interview transcripts is that there are 4 kind of key reasons that kept coming up as to why the women were hesitant to get vaccinated. So the first one is that the vaccine is not halal, so it's not permissible within the Muslim faith. And that's because it uses pig products, or more specifically, China has refused or been unable to say that it doesn't use pork products. But to try and boost vaccine uptake, the Vice President, Maruf Amin, who is an influential Muslim leader, said that in emergencies such as a global pandemic, the vaccine does not need to be certified as halal to be permissible. And you can see the president here, aman dan halal, so it's safe and halal. And Indonesia has a relatively high acceptance rate of regular immunization regimes. So around 80 to 90% of all babies under 1 are immunized for measles, mumps, rubella, and those things. And there hasn't really ever been a discussion about whether they're halal or not. They're just kind of accepted as good practice. But in Indonesia, at the moment, that's one big reason people don't want the vaccine. A second big thing that came out in the interviews was this worry around Sinovac, which is the Chinese produced vaccine, and also links with China. So, and imagine links with communism. So communism is an illegal organization in Indonesia. You can't talk about it. You can't be caught with communist literature or anything. And so, you know, there's all the fear talk that China is trying to bring communism to Indonesia. So we have to reject any kind of vaccine from China. And one of the women asked really specifically about China's producing Sinovac, but they're exporting that and importing vaccines from the UK and the US. If Sinovac was so good, why wouldn't China use that? And also, a lot of the women felt that China was profiteering. So you have to pay for the vaccine in Indonesia, and there's the thought that China's just making a lot of money from the vaccine. So people are hesitant to use it for those reasons. So the third of the 4 kind of themes that came out was a fear around vaccine coercion. So in Indonesia, you can be fined if you refuse the vaccine, up to 450 Australian dollars. You can be fired from your job if you refuse the vaccine. And this is having a spin-off effect that mothers who would have happily had their children immunized are worried that if they take their babies in for their normal immunization, they won't be given the normal immunization. They'll actually, the child will be injected with COVID. So Yana saying here, I decided not to immunize my second baby who was born during this pandemic. I'm afraid that the baby will not be given the regular immunization. And I thought my child might be given the COVID-19 vaccine. And the fourth and final theme that came out during these interviews was a belief in the harm of the vaccine, that people would get sick from it, and also a strong belief in alternative ways of guarding against COVID-19. So the health minister in 2020 kept playing this, pushing this idea that Indonesians have a natural immunity to COVID-19. You don't need to worry about any kind of vaccines, it'll just cure itself. No vaccine is needed, and this is still strongly felt amongst a lot of people. So we had Auntie here say, I do not want to take any risk by having the vaccine. I feel healthy. I just need to perform the health protocols, hand washing, social distancing, and maintain my immunity by taking vitamins. I also need to maintain my health by eating traditional food. If I feel sick and suffer from COVID-19 symptoms, I'll just take vitamins and have a rest. That's easier than getting vaccinated. And so things, jamu, here we can see in the containers, women walk around from house to house and you pay, a little bit of money and you have your glass of jamu, which is some kind of herbal, very potent tasting drink. And there's strong belief that will keep you immune to COVID. And if you get COVID, if you take these traditional remedies, that you'll come through it just fine. So very quickly, just in conclusion then, that even if the vaccine was easily and freely available, hesitancy would remain high in Indonesia. And so, at this point, it's hard to see any kind of positive or short solution to what Indonesia is going through at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharyn. Thank you so much for presenting such an interesting presentation and very comprehensive presentation. Once again, I would like to ask to attendees and audience, please put your questions into the chat. And I would like to present our next speaker. Our next speaker will talk about this pandemic, social media, exploration from the Arab world. Excuse me, first of all, we have to talk about the ethical reasoning. This is quite an interesting topic. And Dr. Susanna Trnka from New Zealand, University of Auckland, will present this issue. Professor Susanna is an associate. Her work focuses on state citizens' relations to the lenses of health and embodiment. Her earliest research focused on political violence and state transformations. In Fiji, she worked predominantly with Indo-Fijians, examining the political development of historical legacies. In the Czech Republic, she analyzed the impact of the 1989 Velvet Revolution on gender roles, and later she was the ways of the events of 1989, how they were collectively remembered, including through their embodied and sensory dimensions. Her next project was a comparative examination of the politics of childhood asthma in the Czech Republic and in New Zealand, analyzing how collective, state, corporate, familial, and personal responsibilities for young people's respiratory health are differently cast in each context. Currently, she is the lead investigator of a multidisciplinary project examining how responsibility for young people's mental well-being is distributed in New Zealand, funded by the Royal Society of New Zealand. She's also examining state-citizen relationship and relations in light of COVID-19 as part of the various multi-country project founded by the Social Science Research Council and the World University Network. Professor Trnka, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction. And thank you, Michael, for organizing this opportunity. I wish I could be in Tbilisi. That would be absolutely fantastic, but maybe in a few years' time, we'll actually make it happen. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Is that running? Can you see the slides?
Yes,
Yeah,
we can.
okay. from beginning. Okay. Okay, so my focus today is on New Zealand, on Aotearoa, New Zealand, and looking specifically at ethical decision making. So how ordinary people engaged in making decisions around the ethics of what they did during the first lockdown, which took place here in March 2020, so just over a year ago. So in 1 year after the first lockdown in March 2021, we had several political commentators and media personalities asking the general public to reflect, looking back on what had happened, on what, if anything, had changed across the nation through the experience of the first lockdown and several lockdowns that then followed. The idea of a lockdown as potentially transformative had first been suggested by New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. Early on into the crisis, indeed, while she was in fact declaring the nation's first lockdown in late March 2020, Ardern had urged the general public, "Be kind," she said. "I know people will want to act as enforcers, and I understand that. People are afraid and anxious. We will play that role for you." In other words, government will play that role. "What we need from you is to support one another. We will get through this together, but only if we stick together. Be strong and be kind." My paper today asks, what came out of this call for national unity, strength, and kindness? As many of us are aware, scholarly examinations of states of emergency often highlight how the crisis imaginary is employed to unjustifiably expand state power, frequently portraying the citizenry as weak or duped by state propaganda. Such representations, however, risk eclipsing how citizens may not only desire states of emergency, but act as their supporters, lawbreakers, critics, arbiters, and enforcers. Indeed, members of democratic societies actively promote or destabilize states of emergency. In the words of political theorist Bonnie Honig, resisting the irresistible, demanding accountability from those who present themselves as beyond such demands, taking exception to the exception, enacting collective life otherwise. Such contestation, moreover, occurs in situations of distrust between citizens and the state, as well as more amicable ones. Given the lockdown requires adopting novel kinds of spatial relations, many of the activities over which New Zealanders reasoned and debated, subverted and supported, punished and surveilled, concentrated on supporting ethical proximities, not only in terms of maintaining distance, but also the keeping near of that or those who were seen as needing to remain close. The maintenance of proper distance is an ethical act and an ordinary facet of social life. Proximity's ethical significance was thrown into stark relief during lockdown through the effort required to uphold new legal regulations. Following the government's mandate that physical interaction be largely restricted to those who shared residences or household bubbles, for many the ongoing question became not whether to comply, but how, when, and to what extent possible. Abilities to make choices were shaped by long-standing relations of disadvantage, notably class and ethnicity, alongside new variables such as occupation and household and family composition. Given the stresses of physical distancing and the existential burdens of coping with a pandemic, ethical decision-making focused not only on how to maintain boundaries, but how to keep proximate those near to us who were suddenly made distant. From March 26 to May 13, 2020, the New Zealand public was ordered to stay home unless exercising, seeking essential supplies or medical care, or providing essential services. Immediately noticeable was the sudden flurry of government posters, flyers, and ads promoting the pandemic response as a collective project, emblazoned with messages of positivity and national unity. "Be kind," they read. "We got this. Staying in this together." And as you can see from the AMI campaign there as well, this wasn't just a government initiative, but it was also often a commercial one. So media organizations and commercial enterprises followed suit, often mimicking some of the mantras of kindness and unity that we heard from the Prime Minister's mouth. At the same time, this was very much a campaign embraced by many members of the general public, which you could see through various mantras and ways of expressing kindness among the general public as well. So one very popular thing was when the Prime Minister called on citizens to express kindness by putting teddy bears in their windows to sort of soften some of the shock of the lockdown. And when I walked just in our neighborhood up and down the street, I counted about close to 150 homes in a short sort of 10, 15-minute walk, all of which had teddy bears displayed in the windows, like in the picture. Another thing was during Anzac Day, people put out red poppies as a display of unity. So combating COVID-19 was portrayed by the government, by commercial enterprises, and by the general public alike as a unified national effort, forward-looking while historically resonant. Not everyone, however, agreed to the lockdown prohibitions, and within days, the police force set up an online system for people to dob in neighbors who were thought to be violating restrictions. This police hotline received 9,600 submissions in the first 48 hours it was running, and this is in a country where the total population is 5 million. Many of these calls the police later determined were unfounded. That said, even among those committed to eradicating the virus, dedication sometimes yielded to other obligations, needs, or desires. We had an online survey, which was part of the Carol Collective that Sharyn spoke about. And in the first tranche of the survey, we asked 3,644 New Zealanders about their thoughts on the lockdown. The vast majority of them strongly supported the lockdown regulations. Many of the same people, however, recounted knowingly contravening them. Often this was due to competing responsibilities, pulling them in multiple directions. They were committed to the team of 5 million, they said. They were endeavoring to uphold lockdown measures, but they found the ethical demands of close relations made distant proved too powerful. And therefore they chose to physically meet with friends and loved ones from who they'd been rendered apart, particularly those who were thought to be struggling. Several recounted circumstances where they felt the need to break the law was obvious and required little explanation. Noting, for example, one woman said in reference to a friend, they were living alone and they were sad. Others had undergone intensive moral debates. Should a dying man be driven to the hospital by his daughter, or should a friend of theirs who was living outside of their bubble drive them together, enabling the daughter to focus on her father's final needs? Some practice physical distancing while nonetheless contravening the regulations. For example, sharing a beer at opposite ends of the driveway following a family member's death. Breaches frequently involve connecting with others via physical touch or co-presence, enabling communication and communion, unachievable through technology. Simultaneously, discomfort arose between those thrust together in ways that were deemed too close, including cohabitants without bonds of kinship or friendship, such as co-tenants or lodgers. Appropriate spatial, affective, ethical distances collapsed when someone fell sick within the same bubble or felt mentally vulnerable while confined to a household of strangers. Intimacies were forced when only one person within a residential bubble of otherwise unconnected individuals was allowed to purchase groceries. These instances revealed how the practical and existential demands of care did not fit the relationalities with which they were involuntarily aligned. While misaligned care relations were a significant source of strain, other motivations existed for breaking the law. These included pleasure seeking and, seemingly ironically, the enforcement of emergency measures. At the height of lockdown, outdoor activities that might require rescue assistance, such as surfing or boating, were banned. Alongside police warnings and possible arrest, rule breakers faced public condemnation. A highly publicized case involved a surfer ordered out of the water at the popular Piha beach, who was photographed approaching police with his middle finger extended. A news site captioned the image, "A surfer is not happy to be questioned by police," and quoted a local academic declaring that surfers were, quote, taking advantage of every other New Zealander who was staying at home. And the more people who flout the rules, the longer we'll be in lockdown, end quote. Over the next 48 hours, the surfer, who's easily identifiable from his picture, received multiple death threats. The backlash against the surfer was particularly dramatic, perhaps because his breach reverberated across multiple registers of the law. Indisputably, he disobeyed lockdown regulations. It was implied he threatened the police. Public outrage was also fanned by the image of a man, the surfer, gesturing threateningly towards a woman, the police officer. Just as importantly, however, the surfer contravened the government's unity campaign. He broke not just the rules, but the spirit of the lockdown. The ethical implications of his actions were publicly calibrated, not against potential contagion, for very few people believe surfing spreads COVID-19, but against the perceived dangers of someone in our midst, shattering images of national cohesion. In his defense, the surfer claimed media misrepresentation, insisting he gestured towards the news photographer, not towards the officer. He also invoked a new dimension of ethical proximities, referring to his adherence to government regulations to stay local, i.e., to not travel outside of one's own neighborhood. This is my home beach, he asserted. I'm in my community. That photographer has driven all the way out here to stand by the police taking photos. While the order to stay local caused confusion across suburban and urban neighborhoods, just how wide is local? In more isolated areas, residential proximities became a marker of safety and solidarity. At Piha and elsewhere, hand-painted signs appeared demanding that non-residents stay out. More controversially, barriers, referred to as roadblocks or checkpoints, depending on one's politics, were erected on roads leading to the far north. In an area whose population is 40% Maori, compared to the national average of around 17%, roads were predominantly patrolled by members of local iwi or Maori tribes, enforcing distance between the us of local residents, some of whom hold traditional guardianship of these lands, and potentially contagious outsiders. Practically and symbolically, the barriers suggested state measures would be ineffective in protecting Maori, evoking, among other things, previous epidemics, ethnically disproportionate mortality rates. They were, moreover, interpreted by critics and supporters as indexing Maoridom's struggle for self-sovereignty. After initially ignoring the situation, the Labour-led government responded to criticism from opposition leaders and people detained at barriers by announcing that the checkpoints must include police representatives, thus simultaneously legitimating and co-opting iwi policing. Checkpoints thus represented highly visible contestations between the people and the state, confirming Honig's critique of Agamben that assessments of states of emergency in democratic societies must look beyond the sovereign to locate the actual bedrock of power in the populace. While checkpoints challenged government leadership, the group that perhaps proved the hardest to integrate into national narratives was expatriate returnees. Part of the appeal of the catchphrase, the team of 5 million, was that New Zealanders were unused to imagining themselves this size. In a curious twist on COVID-19 demographics, Aotearoa's population expanded as expatriates flooded home. The media hailed the reversal of the previous brain drains as a brain gain. Resentment, however, dominated public discourse. As weeks of sacrifice freedom proved successful, and indeed we were without community transmission in 2020 for 102 days straight, antipathy against returnees who might reintroduce the virus intensified. Returnees using outdoor exercise areas such as this one reported verbal abuse from passers-by. Online harassment spiked with news of escapes from quarantine. Formerly us, citizen returnees became effaced, recast as strangers in Simmel and Bauman's terms, and as potential COVID-19 carriers. Symbolic of irresponsible nations who did not do it right. Neither citizenship, previous residence, nor ethnic or kinship ties sufficed to guarantee their inclusion. It often takes work to constitute and maintain suitable distance and closeness. That this is ethical work is denoted by how we take umbrage at distancing or intimacy that violates our sense of appropriateness. These are ordinary ethics, born out of situations we navigate by drawing on culturally delineated moral values, legal and bureaucratic prerogatives, and our face-to-face encounters with others. Do I refrain from visiting my friend, my daughter, my lover who is in trouble? Do I call the police if I see my neighbors leaving town? Are they us, or are they too close to us? The primary reason many people contravened the first lockdown was to retain closeness, suddenly deemed illegitimate. Even though they could email, phone, or Zoom, the ethical summons, to adopt a term from Levinas, to respond by being with one another, claimed precedence. Lockdown also drove some to demand appropriate practices of farness and fairness from others, compelled by calls for interpersonal and collective care, respect of the law, and concerns over contagion that strengthened and fractured the bonds of commonality. I have considered 4 instances in which proximity was mediated: the breaching of regulations, the dobbing in of rule breakers, local boundary maintenance, and transformations of returnees into strangers. Together, these represent a fraction of how the state of emergency was not just lived through, but constituted by the general public. For even if the sovereign declares the exception, in democracies, sovereignty remains, to quote Honig, implicated in and dependent upon popular power. With initially minimal police enforcement, Aotearoa's 2020 state of emergency not only required citizen participation in the state's call for a nationwide transformational project, but simultaneously became the staging ground for citizens' legal, illegal, and extra-legal determinations of where and when everyday proximities should be extended, sustained, or revoked. It thus reinscribed the nation state as a primary locus of political engagement, while also revealing the fault lines of community unity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation. And now I would like to welcome the next speaker of our expert panel, Noha Fikry from University of Toronto, Canada. Noha Fikry is a PhD student in anthropology at University of Toronto. Her research interests include the anthropology of food, ecological anthropology, and the anthropology of the Middle East. After finishing her MA, Noha spent 2 academic years teaching at the American University in Cairo. Guided by her professors, Noha takes it as a duty to train and help critical undergraduate students get published, and this presentation is based on a collaborative chapter written with that aim. Noha Fikry, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you very much everyone for being here amongst us, in spite of the time differences and being July, of course. So today I'm going to present a co-authored chapter that I have published in the edited volume by Professor Sharyn. And while I would like to engage with the arguments in the chapter, I would also like to spend some time discussing the process of publishing a co-authored chapter with a group of undergraduate students, all of whom are not necessarily majoring in social sciences at all, not sociology, not anthropology, and then actually give a bit of insight or a bit of like some suggestions or propositions on how publishing can take place with your professors, because I also know that we have a lot of students in the audience. So I'd like to help you out with this a bit if we have time. So yes, so basically the chapter is titled COVID-19, the Pandemic, Social Media Explorations from the Arab World. And it came out of an undergraduate course that I was teaching more than a year ago now at the American University in Cairo. And the course is titled Arab Society. And basically, it's an introductory sociology and anthropology course in which we are obviously trying to explore what is the Arab society, where does it exist, how is it formed, how has it historically developed, and all of that. But the challenge has always been that whenever I'm teaching this course, I'm teaching it to mostly Arab students. So they're mostly Egyptians, with a few exceptions of foreign students who are spending a semester abroad or so. So basically, how do we engage with Arab society with Arab students? How do they see themselves? How do they define themselves vis-a-vis other Arabs in the region and in Egypt even? So basically, I always, before COVID, I always relied on autoethnographic engagements. By that, I would push students to actually reflect every week on what is happening and what is taking place in their immediate vicinities, whether through outings with friends, meeting families, having visits through with extended family members or friends, and have them basically write and reflect on this in class and like in weekly assignments and even larger assignments. But of course, this was really rendered a challenge because of COVID, because basically we're not going out anymore. So how do we really include this autoethnographic engagement within a virtual space? So just to jump ahead and tell you the main argument of the chapter and then bring you back to the trajectory of building the chapter. The main argument here is really that Facebook offers a very rich ethnographic ground for anthropological and sociological reflection, especially at a time when real ethnographic fieldwork in person, that is rendered impossible or inaccessible in most cases. And in the case of Egypt, basically Facebook plays a role of a moral police in which the shared memes and the news updates and the posts maintain or strengthen boundaries defining Arab society from a non-Arab, a foreign, or an Asian other. So back to the trajectory. So on March 12th, 2020, the American University in Cairo decided to shift all its teaching activities on Zoom and Blackboard Learn, which is another website that we use. And with a large body of 30 students in class and a very unstable internet quality in Egypt, it was really difficult to carry out synchronous classes in the beginning of the pandemic. At least I thought it was impossible to happen. So I was thinking, okay, how can we do that? And how can we try and maintain this vivid nature of the class based on discussions and informal reflections on weekly and family visits, etc. So what happened is that, okay, I was trying to reflect where are we spending most of the time at that point in the beginning of the pandemic? And my answer was basically straight up, very easily, social media, and mainly Facebook. So I decided to put in conversation the social scientist in us with the social media user in us. And then I shifted all the class meetings on Facebook through creating a closed Facebook group only for the class, students, and myself. And then I would basically post a weekly mini lecture and then a few ethnographic posts, basically trying to push us to think with surroundings, what have been happening or what has been happening in this week or during this week as related to the theme of the class on that week, whether gender, politics, religion, or social class, you name it. And really what we were trying to do through this move to Facebook is basically theorizing Facebook as a field site in which we were learning but also observing and taking note of our social surroundings and our social circles engagement on Facebook. What do our families share? What do our friends share and why? And what do these patterns of shared posts and news updates and memes actually tell us about a contemporary Arab world and the subject of the course, Arab society? So in order to push the reflections further, I made this into the final assignment of the class. Basically, a final essay exploring Arab world, the Arab society, through the lens of social media and the shared memes and updates. And in this, we were really very careful in focusing on the posts and the shared updates of people that we actually know, whether immediate circles, friends, and family. And this is because we really knew and we were trying to remind ourselves all the time that social media is not a world on its own at all. It is really part of the offline world, so to speak. And so the condition of the essay and the material to be incorporated in the essay was always that we are exploring or observing or analyzing posts shared by people we know in light of our online knowledge of them. So yes, basically now I want to give you just a brief historical view of Facebook and Facebook presence in Egypt. So it began as a very exclusive virtual space for Arab youth, basically associated with courting and with explicit content. And then it slowly developed into a very normative space, densely populated by parents and even grandparents who suddenly discovered Facebook and all signed up for it to reconnect with distant family members that they can no longer see. So this is reflected by numbers. For example, we have the Arab Social Media Report reflecting that in the 7-year period between 2010 and 2017, we have 14 million new users joining Facebook in Egypt, adding up to 30 million users out of a total population of 96 million at the time. And we really expect the numbers to have spiked even higher since then. So this really hyper presence of parents and grandparents made Facebook into what we call an Arab home salon. And basically the salon in most Arab homes is this room kept for visitors. And by extension, this is the room where the most forcible and irrelevant small talk takes place. So this, by linking Facebook to an Arab home salon, what we were trying to push is actually to again think of Facebook as a moral police, as the space in which families, and particularly parents and grandparents, govern and scrutinize each other's presence. So one significant genre of the shared posts is memes. And memes were really again used here to reinforce certain social norms that are and pandemic rituals along very classist and very racist overtones. So in his introductory chapter to this series or edited volume, Professor Ryan theorizes COVID as a syndemic. And a syndemic is basically a way to describe the intertwining health and social dimensions of our moment and the pandemic. To taking this one step further, we explore COVID here in the chapter as a pandemic, as one enunciation of this health society nexus through social media and the particular focus on memes. So the question is, what are memes? So memes are originally or were originally developed in biology, then were further developed as a concept by social scientists and media scholars to, and I quote, describe the propagation of items such as jokes, rumors, videos, and websites from one person to another via the internet. And unlike virals, the interesting thing about memes is that with every share, you get people edited. So I can share the same video with a very different caption. I can share the same image with a totally different context or on a totally different note. So this is why it's also a very creative process of sharing and resharing. So our primary explorations, very quickly to go back to, again, to take you back to the publishing process, the primary explorations are that we have a reversed internalized Orientalism. And by that we mean that given a very long history of colonialism in the Arab world, we have what we call a foreigner's complex that denounces everything Arab in favor for everything Western. So the habits, the thought, and media are always like favored from the Western world, not from the Arab world at all. And this was surprisingly, even if momentarily, reversed during COVID in the way that memes were actually critiquing Western habits and mocking the rising pandemic cases, which were not at that time that rising in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt, or basically taking pride in Egypt offering aid to European countries earlier in the pandemic. And we also have a lot of classist memes that were always making fun of people in lower social classes or in more impoverished communities and groups who are still going to work just because they can't afford to stay at home, they can't afford to work from home, people making fun of others who are hanging their masks for reuse because they can't afford disposable masks. And we also tried to adapt Dr. Kubler-Ross 5-stage model for the process of grief to understanding the way through which memes actually operated or shifted from across stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And so, yes, we were basically trying to push for or understand Facebook as a field site and memes as very interesting ethnographic artifacts that we should take seriously and as modes of knowledge production. But we were also trying to explore these momentarily shifting power dynamics, or at least the creation of a space of reflection in which Egypt, but also the Arab world more broadly, was basically at least problematizing global hierarchies and power structures. So how the chapter came together is that I'm really very, very thankful for the mentorship of Professor Ryan. I was his undergraduate student many, many years ago, and he was the first one who actually pushed me to publish with him. And we published, like we began with an encyclopedia entry, and then he was always the person who supported me most in trying out publishing, even if it doesn't work out in the end. So what happened is that when Professor Ryan basically circulated the call for this edited volume, I thought, okay, the essays that the students have written in this course are really wonderful. They're mostly very insightful, very clearly written. They engage with social media very sociologically. So I thought this actually must go to a wider audience. It must be shared with the wider audience. So I developed a quick like abstract or a quick idea for the chapter. I sent it out and it got accepted. And then what happened is that I chose a paragraph or two from each of the papers that were very well written. And then I created a shared Google document in which we would all be working on workshopping each other's basically paragraphs after I provided initial comments, of course. And then we wrote together the introduction and the conclusion for the paper and developing the argument. So really my proposition or my suggestion here is to take undergraduate and graduate papers very seriously. And this is an advice for students, me, myself being one of them. I think that it's very important to do our best in the weekly, but also the major writing assignments that we have in the courses, because these are really the products of our labor basically, but also the insight that we have building through the months of the coursework. So I think we should always try and submit them for publication. And in your undergraduate and graduate years, there are multiple student journals and undergraduate journals that you can check out. Always try and stay updated with calls for special issues, for edited volumes, or for thematic journal issues. And then it's not going to do any harm to basically submit an abstract or even the paper as a work in progress, because this process really pushes you to think of writing differently and to take your work very seriously and to share it with wider audiences, which I think is very, very, very worthwhile. And yes, definitely ask your mentors for feedback first, for suggestions, for propositions. Also, because we have to, I think, relate to our writing as always something that is developing like a child or a growth of even a plant. It has to be nurtured and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of labor for the fruit to actually end up appearing. And yes, I think I'm going to close off on that note and looking forward to all your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah, for this wonderful presentation, very interesting research findings. And now I would like to ask to audience, please put the questions into the chat and I will pass them on to the presenters. So now I'm very happy and honored to welcome Professor Sari Hanafi to this opening panel. Professor Sari will talk about the post-COVID sociology. Sari Hanafi is currently a professor of sociology, director of the Center of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies, and chair of the Islamic Studies program at the American University of Beirut. He is a president of the International Sociological Association. Recently, he's created the portal for social impact of the scientific research on the Arab world. He was a vice president of the board of the Arab Council of the Social Science. He's as well as editor of the Arab Journal of Sociology named Idafat. Among his recent books are Knowledge Production in the Arab World, The Impossible Premise. He's the winner of the 2040 Abdel Hamid Showman Award and in 2050 Kuwait Award for the Social Science. In 2019, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of the National University of San Marcos. So after this introduction, I would like to welcome Professor Sari Hanafi and this panel. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just to see where is okay, so do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we see.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so first of all, I'm so glad to be with you, and I'm eager as a president of the International Sociological Association to be in virtually with Georgia. I know there are many sociologists member of ISA, and I'm glad to ISA to be more proactive in the whole region, the Asian side of the world. So actually, thank you so much so far. What I heard from Noha, from Sharyn, from Susan, from Michael, and my talk will be a kind of extension of Michael, if you like, a tone of thinking the world of post-COVID-19. Here I will specifically talk about what kind of post-COVID-19 sociology we hope. And of course, things is not always as we hope. So again, no need to say that COVID-19 show that we cannot revert to business as usual, and we need to rethink our world. I like the way Michael put it, that how we will cohabitate with the virus, how we take into account actant in Bruno Latour vocabulary. So this is the big challenge. And so just to say that the way I theorize COVID-19, considering it as a disease not only of globalization, but of Anthropocene. So the greed of a human consumerism is depleting resources that our Earth cannot renew. And this virus is but one episode of this consumerism. And so such voracious consumerism is indeed induced by the mythological access of happiness. This is what usually I use this term. As I see it, this eagerness to eat every time new animals and to put it on our table. And although we know it's not tasty, but this is a sign of distinction in the vocabulary of Pierre Bourdieu. So in my previous 2 years ago, I wrote a piece about global sociology, putting emphasis about what should be a global sociology, supplementing the current post-colonial approach with an anti-authoritarian one. Noha knows that, for instance, our region, how the authoritarianism is hampering our knowledge production with censorship, with even torturing scholars, anyone who dare to critique government, but also rethink secularism in the framework of post-secularism. So this is something I put a lot of emphasis on them. Today, what I consider post-COVID-19 sociology, I will look to two things. What kind of logic of sociological analysis we need to deploy, and the scope of sociology as a vocation. So simply a few words about the logic of sociological analysis, where I should remind you the late Australian philosopher Val Plumwood, who rejected the hyper-separation between self and other, and between humanity and nature. Society and nature are perceived each as differentiated into separate compartments. So, the sphere of nature, culture, politics, social, economy, and religion are indeed traversed by common logics that allow a given society to be encompassed in its totality. So we need really to stop looking to this sphere as a compartmentalized in the way that we often did it. And then, and what is really this total social fact for me is not only to say that human being is looking always for own interest and they become homo economicus, but also how human beings have cultivated gift-giving practices as an anthropological foundation innate within social relationships. And here you can refer to Marcel Mauss' work on the gift. The second point I will deal here is the scope of our vocation as a sociologist. So, so first, let me say that I found that amazingly a good text of the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze criticizing the left in the 80s, saying that the left is often disconnected from the community because they begin looking to the relationship from the most distance and move to the local. So for instance, if we look to the social classes, we will talk about the impact of the imperialism, colonialism, and then we will describe the social classes in an abstract way. And often when we reach to connect ourselves to the local, we are analytically exhausted, and even for praxis. So in contrary of this, we notice more and more there is a social movement. Sometimes they come from the right wing and extreme right wing, where they and religious groups, where they care about the local. They start by the community, the family, and then go up to think about the nation state and maybe the ummah, the concept of ummah. And I noticed, for instance, how fast a grassroots organization in Lebanon to deal with the plight of the lockdown that Lebanon has during this pandemic. And often this organization is a religious one. So if you like, what the proposal I do for post-COVID-19 sociology is really to have this capability to do this back and forth between the local and the global. So this is very important to rethink the importance of family, community, the ethics of love, hospitality, and caring, and of course, scaling up to the level of nation state and humanity. And here, just I need to remind you what Michael Burway remind us about the role, the task of sociology as a discipline which is not neutral, but stand with the civil society against both state and market domination. So this is absolutely crucial, but I will add two tasks, another task. Sorry, I need to stop because I have emergency call, so I need to take it into account. Sorry.
Yes, we understand. We are.
رضوان أنا بتوك بخلص بعد ربع ساعة. أوكي، ربع ساعة. ألو؟ إيه أنا آسف بس أنا بقلب التوك. فيكم تروحوا. إيه مش أكيد، لا مريض جاي لحالي. أوكي يلا باي. أوكي. I'm really sorry, but it was an emergency. Okay, so so we need to extend the sociological mission beyond civil society. The work of Geoffrey Alexander is very important on civil sphere. So civil society is only one sphere among others with a broader social system in which the family, religious group, scientific and corporate association, and geographically bounded geographical communities should be incorporated, as they all produce goods and organize their social relations according to different ideals and constraints. So this extension of our mission is very important if we are to keep looking at ourselves as a guardian of this civil sphere and liberal democratic ideals. So here, this leads me to the second extension, is how to mediate with the different non-civil sphere and engage in dialogue with them and demand certain kind of reforms. What are the means of mediations? It is carried out basically through providing cognitive validity claims and normative argumentative to the public sphere. But is this sufficient? We know from the brilliant work of Hans Jonas on values that we need to account for value commitments of social actors, and this include emotion. So, which means it is not enough to simply support those who have liberal democratic ideals. We also need to listen attentively to those who refuse to embrace partially or totally these ideals. So let us remember the fantastic work of Arlie Hochschild about rural white Americans in Louisiana. They have turned into Trump supporters, expressing their distance vis-a-vis globalization and their vision of social inequality. Before judging them, let us listen, for instance, in the case of Europe, for instance, to those who have fears of Syrian and African migrants coming to Europe. With our normative methods, presupposition, and explicit commitments, I would like here to emphasize our capacity of dialoguing and mediating with non-civil spheres. So against a radical critical social theory, I call for a situated critical one. And I come from the Arab world, by the way, where I see that the division by secular elite formation and religious elite formation is disastrous, and how some secular elite they make a critical, so radical critical theory that they cannot be absorbed within our religious society. So while criticizing power, is also able to simultaneously open up dialogue with the very force it critique. So for instance, we can enter into conflict without slaughtering each other. So we all need to remember Paul Ricoeur's aphorism in defining what should be our ethics, that being the aim of living the good life with and for others with just institutions. In other words, the ethics of love, hospitality, solicitude, and care with and for others, which is a practical reason on humanity that can be fully expressed in just institutions that ensure social justice and democracy. So this convivial way of conceiving our sociology as a vocation is an invitation for thinking responsibility before freedom and how to foster and encourage meaningful relationships with our other fellow human being with modesty and open-mindedness. Before cogito, there is hello, said Emmanuel Levinas. But in no way should my focus on the issue of recognition overshadow issues of redistribution, as Nancy Fraser reminds us in her conversation with Axel Honneth. While our sociological endeavor may provide knowledge on poverty, social inequality, and extent of refugee issues, it should mobilize emotion and moral impulse, compassion, altruism, solidarity, and activism. The aim is to go beyond describing and criticizing social life toward intellectually constructing a framework for society, a society that incorporates all its citizens while respecting all forms of pluralism without pushing the other into assimilation to cultural majorities. Here, for instance, I am thinking more particularly in how France deals today with the Muslim problem and how these citizens who refuse to be assimilated provide the French society with a mirror, a crooked, passion-laden mirror in which to see a reflection of its own identity and societal problem and its tough conception of secularism. Let me finish by say that while sociology underwent a process of disenchantment, that being the emphasis on rationality and rationalization as part of its professionalization in the late 19th and 20th centuries, it is time to re-enchant it through collaboration with moral social philosophy and other social sciences. And of course, just one word that either our role is to support the local tradition of sociological knowledge production, but also to generate a kind of a global sociology which is modest, acknowledge the positionality of author, always invite people for comparatism and have a mild universalism. So this is how I envisage a kind of post-COVID-19 sociology. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanafi. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, very interesting and comprehensive. So now I would like to thank to all of our guest speakers for this wonderful talks and comprehensive presentations, and I think we have time to start our Q&A, and we have a few questions here in our chat, and they are quite long questions. I will try to read all of them quite slowly if we have enough time. So the first question is to Michael Ryan. How much the understanding of the social justice in different social and cultural contexts was linked to the manner it was presented during the pandemic? Mr. Ryan?
That's an interesting question. If I understand it correctly, it's kind of asking the way in which social justice movements might have changed as a result of the pandemic or during the pandemic, if I understood that right. And I think the answer depends entirely on what the social movement was, who was engaged in the social movement, what part of the world the social movement was happening. I can think of perhaps some general ideas. I think there has been a greater shift to digital efforts in all aspects of our lives, but I think that it's very important to remember that access to the digital world is highly limited. It wasn't until 2017 that even half the world's population had access to digital technologies. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were still some 3.6 billion people offline. So for many of us, presumably all of us who are here connected on Zoom from different parts of the world, I think we kind of take that for granted, the access that we have to digital technology. So I think there's been this greater shift in social justice movements to digital technologies when those are available. I think simultaneously, there's been a recognition that we have to move beyond it and that we have to find different ways to get out into the communities, especially in areas that are not connected. I think maybe a broader issue that I've seen happening is in social justice movements is there's been, I don't want to call it a distraction, but I do want to call it a distraction away from getting towards goals or advancing things towards having to continually combat misinformation, especially around the pandemic. So a lot of efforts have been not so much in presenting new information as countering the information that's already out there. The ideas that the virus is something that Bill Gates is using to gain our information, or that the Chinese are using to kill us all. I've heard all sorts of interesting things. There's a member, I'm from a very small town in the middle of the US, and there's someone in town who's obsessed with the idea that if you get the vaccine, that the mark of the devil from the Bible will appear on your body somewhere. So it's about combating that kind of misinformation. And I think a lot of social justice movements have been sort of, again, I don't want to say distracted, but maybe I do, toward having to take on this new task. Whereas where there's always been a lot of misinformation, I think around the pandemic, it's gained more political power than perhaps it had before.
Thank you so much, Michael. And the next question this question was from, I have to read the name, Evgenia Galeogian, so student from Ilia State University. Another question today. So maybe I will ask individual questions. Sharyn Graham Davies. This is a question from Lasha Nonikashvili, from Ilia State University, student. Thank you very much for your very interesting research. Did you study each forms of practices in different socioeconomic settings to generalize the research perspectives? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Lasha. Thank you for that. It's a great question, but it's a difficult question. Yes, they do vary, greatly across. I mean, Indonesia has, 17,000 islands, 260 million people, some of the richest people in the world, and some people who are living on less than $1 a day. And so their experiences are so incredibly different. But what I can say to that is, at a top level political messaging, it's been incredibly confusing. We have health officials who just have no idea really about health things. Not long ago, women were warned not to go into swimming pools because they could get pregnant by this super sperm that would be swimming around swimming pools. And this was from a health official. And so, you know, this messaging that is coming down is really powerful. Indonesians are some of the highest users of social media in the world. And of course, like everywhere, there's an anti-vax, you know, kind of stream. And so people are getting different perceptions from that. And of course, you know, Islam is incredibly diverse, and the opinions that can circulate around that. So the common thing is a lot of misinformation and a lot of disparity in who can access things. If you're in Jakarta, it's really difficult, but there are actually at least hospitals. If you're out in the Riau Islands, there are no hospitals. So you just have very different experiences. But yeah, good question.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your interesting answer. And the next one is from Teata Knishvili, Professor to Susanna Trnka. This question is directed. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Do you think that the ethical reasoning you investigated in your research can be considered more country specific?
Thank you for that. Again, another very interesting question. I mean, on the very surface level, obviously some of the details wherever you're looking are going to be country specific. So, you know, the debates around should you go surfing or not are going to be in some contexts and not others. The way that Indigenous rights get probably more seriously issue, the way Indigenous rights get expressed and who is on which sides and how they're perceived within the space of a pandemic as well, may be more or less country specific. But I think the larger issue that I was trying to point to, the idea that we move beyond kind of looking at compliance versus non-compliance to looking at the actual different kinds of activities that people engage with to sustain or question or sometimes try and overturn or ignore lockdown prohibitions. I think that is a question that can be looked at in different spaces. So I'd like to kind of move us out of they're compliant or they're not compliant, they're complacent or they're not complacent, to actually looking at people as being more agentive and looking at some of the forms of reasoning that they go through. And that, I think, is a broader question than just a New Zealand question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And another question for Adam, to Sharyn Davies again. Statistics in Indonesia, such as stigmatized COVID-19 sufferers, doubting vaccines, relying on alternative medicines to treat COVID-19 related to the profit struggles. Sorry, it is so, my monitor is very far from me and I'm struggling with this distance.
That's all right. I can read the question as I answer it. So that's all good. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, good question again.
Thank you so much, Sharyn.
Yeah, so looking at, you know, the stigmatizing of COVID-19 suffering, and then the doubting of the vaccine, and then relying on alternative medicines and how this might be related to profit. And I think, you know, my cynical self says absolutely that the big pharmaceutical companies are, you know, as they are everywhere, trying to make some profit out of that. And I think this is a global issue, right? Like here in Australia, it's still difficult to get the vaccine, but somehow, you know, our Prime Minister managed to wangle extra doses for Australia, even though we've had, you know, hardly any deaths and, you know, and nothing like Indonesia. And so you have to question the equity of Australia being able to access more Pfizer vaccines. We have a lot of AstraZeneca. We have so much AstraZeneca that it's just going to waste because people, you know, don't want to take that. They just want to wait for Pfizer. And here we have Indonesia on our doorstep where people are dying in their thousands because they can't get access to any vaccine. And so, you know, for Australians to refuse AstraZeneca and Indonesia not to have any, you know, this plays into this whole global situation of unethical economics, and I think that's happening in Indonesia. And of course there'll be traditional herbal medicines that are being marketed by different organizations as a way that's very safe, and you know, maybe they're doing that out of care, but a lot of that will be, you know, profit driven as well. Yeah, and so just the final part then of the question, yeah, other factors given the tendency of Indonesia to rely heavily on social media for COVID-19 problems, and that's absolutely the case. I think most people get their information through WhatsApp, so WhatsApp is a huge platform in Indonesia, and families will spread something, some kind of information, and if you get it from a family member, you believe that, and often it's not the case at all. So a lot of that's coming through poor messaging, and you don't have a government that's giving a clear, consistent message about what's safe to do. So thanks, Adam.
Thank you so much. Actually, so we got the next question from Nazarbayev. To all of the presenters or panelists, disinformation and the misinformation surrounding COVID-19, particularly the vaccination, has become a major issue. Not even the wealthiest and most developed societies are immune to the disinformation campaigns. What do you think is the explanation behind the COVID disinformation campaigns being so effective in dividing societies? What can we as society or the government can do to address this issue? So this is a general question. Maybe you will decide yourself who will answer. And I have to mention that we are running out of time, and I'm so glad that actually we presented all of this, our agenda very well, but still we have a few minutes to answer this general question.
I'll just hop in here to get us going, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll keep it short. I think the answer, the explanation behind a disinformation campaign is the easy go-to of politics. Right? We've seen how people have been able to gain a lot of political power through spreading disinformation. They've been able to use it to mobilize bases, because a lot of this disinformation falls along the same sort of fundamental mentalities that a lot of particularly conservative right-wing bases tend to have. It's anti-science, it's anti-education, it creates a very clear us, them, the government's trying to control me. You know, a problem we have in the States, I need my gun, that's my right. You can't tell me what to do with my body, unless you're a woman, of course, then we can tell you. So I think it just fits the narrative. A lot of this misinformation around COVID fits the narrative of the kinds of misinformations and lack of critical thinking skills, anti-science mentalities that come with a lot of the bases of people who are spreading and believing this misinformation.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. So as I mentioned, so we are running out of time, sadly. I think we have exhausted you with so many questions. So I just want to thank you so much for really interesting and comprehensive presentations, covering so much ground. And I also would like to thank for answering all the questions the students and the colleagues arrived here. Sadly, we cannot take you at the reception, but still, it's been a pleasure to have you here to talk to us about the sociology in time of a pandemic. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure everyone has enjoyed it as much as I have. I can just remind everyone here that our conference continues. We have absolutely stellar lineup of speakers and panels, and we were very much looking forward to welcoming you to one of our sessions and panels. So please check your website of the conference program and various talks and panels available there. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.